Some betrayals are so loud they shake the very roots of the earth. Others are performed quietly, before thousands of witnesses, in the language of a man who has convinced himself that what he destroys is worth less than what he gains. History remembers many rulers who lost their crowns. Some lost them in battle. Some lost them to age and sickness. Some handed them willingly to those who came after. But in the ancient records buried beneath the great halls of Wolfgar, there is one account unlike all the others. It is the story of an Alpha who lost an entire kingdom, not to an enemy army, not to a plague, not to a rival ruler, but to the consequences of a single act of cruelty witnessed by a force older than any crown ever worn by mortal hands. The scribes of Wolfgar wrote about many things. They recorded harvests and hunts, battles and births, the treaties that held the northern territories together across centuries of brutal winters. But the event they returned to again and again, the one that changed everything, is described in their archives with a sentence so simple it feels almost unfair. He made her kneel. 3 words. And yet those 3 words unraveled a kingdom. The kingdom of Wolfgar sat at the center of the northern territories like a crown jewel worn by the land itself. Its stone citadel rose from the earth with quiet authority, its high walls draped in dark banners that snapped sharply in the cold mountain wind. Beyond the citadel, rolling farmlands stretched toward the horizon, dotted with villages whose smoke curled upward in thin gray ribbons each morning. The people of Wolfgar were proud, capable, and deeply loyal to the bloodline that had kept them safe for generations. At the head of that bloodline stood Alpha Cody Rodriguez. Cody was 31 years old and had earned every gray whisker beginning to appear at his temple. He stood taller than most of the men in his pack, with wide shoulders wrapped in black armor detailed in silver at the chest and wrists. His dark hair fell just past his jaw, and his eyes, deep brown shot through with amber, were the kind that scanned a room in seconds and missed nothing. He was not a man who smiled easily. His jaw was always set, his posture always straight. He had learned very young that weakness was a language enemies understood, and he refused to speak it. He had spent the better part of a decade expanding Wolfgar's reach. He had negotiated trade routes, suppressed border raids, and rebuilt the citadel's eastern wing after a fire had nearly gutted it during the siege of the Greyrock Pack. He was efficient. He was respected. He was, by any reasonable measure, an excellent ruler. But Cody Rodriguez had one blind spot so large it could swallow him whole. He had confused power with wisdom. His beta, William, had tried to point this out to him once, in the careful way loyal men sometimes do. Not with direct accusation but with a question slipped quietly into a longer conversation. My Alpha, do you ever consider that a kingdom built entirely on strategy has no heart to sustain it when the strategy fails? Cody had laughed. Not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who believes he already has all the answers he needs. Wolfgar does not need a heart, William. It needs alliances. It needs land. It needs grain that lasts through winter. Hearts are for songs and stories. I am building something real. William had nodded and said nothing more. He had learned that some lessons could not be taught. They could only be lived. The marriage alliance that Cody had chosen was with House Eslick, one of the wealthiest and most politically connected families in the Northern Territories. Lord Alfredo Eslick controlled the Fernwood Valley, a stretch of fertile farmland so rich that a single season's harvest there could feed Wolfgar for an entire winter. Alfredo was a heavy-set man with silver hair, expensive rings on every finger, and a laugh loud enough to rattle the windows. He smiled often and meant very little of it. His legitimate daughter, Tanya Eslick, had been raised to understand one truth above all others. Appearance was everything. Tanya was beautiful in the way that well-crafted weapons are beautiful, deliberately, precisely, and with a purpose that had nothing to do with warmth. She had inherited her father's golden hair and wore it in elaborate braided arrangements that required 2 attendants and most of the morning to perfect. Her gowns were always white or cream or the palest gold, chosen to contrast against the dark stone walls of every room she entered and make her impossible to miss. She spoke quietly so that people leaned in to hear her. She smiled constantly so that people forgot to question her. She had been practicing the role of Luna since she was 14 years old, and she was very, very good at it. What Tanya was not good at, what she had never learned to do, was tolerate someone else occupying a room she considered hers. And Diana Eslick had always occupied the same rooms. Diana was Lord Alfredo's second daughter. The one the household staff called the quiet one. The one the nobles at dinner parties occasionally forgot was there until she refilled their goblets. She was illegitimate, born of a brief alliance between Alfredo and a healer woman from the southern villages who had died when Diana was still small enough to carry. Alfredo had kept Diana because sending her away would have created uncomfortable questions. He had kept her close enough to use and far enough from power that she would never be a threat. Diana had grown up understanding exactly what she was in that household. Not a daughter, not a servant. Something in between that had no clean name. She had long dark wavy hair that she kept simply braided because she had no attendants to help her. Her eyes were a quiet shade of silver blue, the kind of color that changed depending on the light, gray indoors, almost luminous in open air. She was slender but not fragile, with hands roughened slightly from the work she took on in the villages. She had taught herself herbal medicine from old texts she found in the back of Alfredo's library, and she had spent years quietly helping the sick and poor in the surrounding settlements, asking nothing in return. The villagers adored her. They called her the healer's daughter, even though her mother had been gone for decades. They left fresh bread at the edge of the road when they knew she was coming. Old McGee, who ran the village mill, once told a traveler that Diana Eslick had more goodness in her smallest finger than the whole Eslick manor put together. Diana had smiled when she heard that, and then quietly told McGee she was going to stop repeating it before it got back to Tanya. She did not need enemies. She had enough complications. On the morning of the engagement ceremony, the official celebration marking the formal announcement of Cody and Tanya's upcoming union, Diana rose before dawn, as she always did, and walked the 3 miles to the village on the eastern road to check on Kelsey, a young mother recovering from a difficult birth. She brought dried herbs, clean bandages, and a small pot of warm broth she had cooked herself. She sat with Kelsey for an hour, making sure the baby fed well, making sure Kelsey's hands had stopped trembling. She walked back in time to dress in her plain gray attendant's gown, pin her hair neatly, and take her place at the edge of the ceremony grounds, invisible as expected. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that fate had been rearranging itself, quietly and with great patience, for a very long time. The engagement ceremony was held in the royal square at the center of Wolfgar's citadel, beneath a canopy of dark silk strung between ancient stone columns. Thousands of wolves gathered, nobles in their finest furs and embroidered cloaks, merchants in pressed linen, village representatives who had traveled 2 days to witness the occasion. The square smelled of pine resin torches and baked bread from the market stalls set up along the outer edges to feed the crowd. Cody stood at the center of the stone platform in his formal black armor, flanked by William on his right and the pack's elder council on his left. He looked exactly like what he was, a powerful alpha at the peak of his strength, about to secure the future of his kingdom. His expression was composed and certain. Tanya arrived on her father's arm in a gown of white and gold so elaborate it seemed to have been designed not for wearing but for witnessing. The crowd parted for her. Nobles nodded. Alfredo beamed with the particular pride of a man who had successfully negotiated a business deal. And then Diana, standing near the back of the crowd, where she had been assigned to manage refreshments for the council members, felt something she had never felt before in her life. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was closer to the feeling of a door swinging open in a room you had lived in your whole life and discovering that it led somewhere vast. Her silver blue eyes found Cody Rodriguez across a crowd of thousands, and his amber brown eyes found her. The bond snapped into place like a lock finding its key after years of searching. Diana stopped breathing. She had read about the fated mate bond in old texts. She had heard the elders describe it as a moment of absolute recognition, the sensation of meeting something that had always been yours, returning after an impossibly long absence. She had read those descriptions with the comfortable distance of someone studying something that happened to other people in other lives. She had not expected it to feel like this. She had not expected it to feel like coming home. Across the square, Cody went very still. His wolf, the great restless spirit that had paced within him for years, suddenly stopped pacing. It turned toward the pole with the single-minded certainty of a compass finding north. His gaze moved through the crowd and landed on a young woman in a plain gray attendance gown standing near the refreshment table. Dark wavy hair, silver blue eyes, hands that were slightly rough at the knuckles, he would notice later, from years of work she had done without asking for recognition. His wolf knew her before his mind could organize the information. She was the one. For exactly 5 seconds, Cody Rodriguez stood at the edge of the life he had always wanted and the life he was meant to have, and he felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a hand on his chest. Then Tanya's hand closed over his arm, and the elder council was watching, and Lord Alfredo was smiling his wide political smile, and 3,000 wolves were waiting, and Cody made the first terrible decision of his life. He looked away from Diana. The ceremony should have ended there. Most of it had already been accomplished. The formal words spoken, the contract signed, the crowd satisfied with the spectacle. Cody should have let Diana slip quietly back to whatever corner of the estate she normally occupied, and perhaps, in private, begun to grapple with what he now knew. Perhaps he would have found a way to do the right thing in time. Perhaps not. But Alfredo Eslick noticed. He was a man who had built his fortune and influence by reading rooms accurately, and what he read in those 5 seconds. In the stillness of Cody's body, in the way the Alpha's gaze had pulled like a tide toward a woman in a gray gown, chilled him with a specific kind of fear, the fear of a plan about to unravel. He stepped close to Cody during the brief pause between the formal reading and the public toast. "I assume you understand what just happened," Alfredo said, his voice low and carrying the particular weight of a man who does not ask questions so much as deliver information. "I also assume you understand that it changes nothing. The Fernwood Valley lands were promised to Wolfgar through this union. That promise was made before fate decided to be inconvenient." Cody said nothing. His jaw tightened. "If you act on that bond," Alfredo continued, "you lose Fernwood. You lose the political weight of my house. You lose the alliance with the 3 northern packs who have already accepted Tanya as the future Luna. Everything you have built, the peace, the expansion, the 3 years of careful negotiation, collapses over a girl who has no title, no land, no bloodline worth speaking of, and no political value whatsoever." Still Cody said nothing. "I need to know right now," Alfredo said, "what kind of alpha you are." And in that moment, standing at the wrong crossroads and listening to the wrong voice, Cody Rodriguez made his choice. He turned to William and spoke quietly enough that only his beta could hear him. "Bring Diana Eslick to the front of the square." William looked at him, just looked at him, and what William saw in his alpha's expression made something in the beta's chest sink with a weight that would take years to lift. "Alpha, do it." Diana had no idea what was happening when 2 council guards appeared at her side and guided her through the crowd. The sea of people parted as she was walked forward, and by the time she understood that she was being brought to the stone platform, to stand before the Alpha, in front of every wolf in Wolfgar, her heart was beating with a confused hope she had not yet learned to protect herself against. She thought, for one impossible moment, that he was going to acknowledge the bond. She thought that perhaps the world was kinder than she had learned to believe. She reached the platform. She stood before Cody Rodriguez, who was taller than she had realized from across the square. She looked up at him, and she saw it, the briefest flash of recognition, of something real, crossing his face before he closed it down behind his alpha's mask. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided to solve. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the entire square. "People of Wolfgar, today, as we celebrate the union between the Rodriguez bloodline and House Eslick, I ask you all to witness an oath of loyalty. Diana Eslick, sister of the future Luna, will kneel before her and swear her allegiance to the woman who will lead this pack. This is not a punishment. This is a public demonstration of the unity and order that will define Wolfgar's future." The square went very quiet. Not the quiet of agreement. The quiet of a crowd that is not sure what it is witnessing but knows it is witnessing something wrong. Diana looked at Cody for a long moment. He did not look away, but he did not soften either. He was asking her to kneel. In front of everyone. Before her sister, who was standing 3 feet away with a smile on her face that she was being very careful to keep small enough to seem gracious. Diana understood then. She understood what had happened and what he was choosing and why. She understood it with the terrible clarity that comes when the world reveals itself to be exactly as hard as you feared it might be. She could have refused. Something fierce in her wanted to. But she was surrounded by guards, and the crowd was watching, and she was Diana Eslick. The girl who had learned very early that the world rewards those who endure quietly and punishes those who make scenes. So she knelt. Her dark wavy hair fell forward. Her hands, slightly rough at the knuckles, pressed flat against the cold stone of the platform. Her silver blue eyes looked at the ground. And in the crowd, old McGee from the village mill turned away so that no one would see her cry. Nobody laughed. That was perhaps the most haunting detail the royal historian Charles Smith would record years later, when he sat down to write the official account of what happened that day. He had expected the crowd to laugh or jeer, or at least murmur their approval. They were silent. 3,000 wolves, and not one of them made a sound. The only person who seemed satisfied was Tanya Eslick, who accepted Diana's sworn loyalty with a gracious nod and a smile so practiced it could have been painted on. And somewhere far above the mortal world, in the vast silver silence between the stars, something very old and very patient opened its eyes. Diana walked back to the manor that evening through the servants' gate, as she always had. The road was empty at that hour, and the night had turned cold with the particular sharpness that comes just before the season changes. She walked without hurrying. There was nowhere to hurry to. The house she would return to was not hers. The bed she would sleep in belonged to the estate. The work she would do tomorrow would belong to whoever needed her. She was 24 years old, and she had never in her life occupied a space that was entirely, permanently, unchallengeably her own. She had thought today might change that. She had spent exactly 5 seconds believing it. She sat down at the base of a large oak at the bend in the road. The same oak she had climbed as a child. The same one whose roots she had sat against during the summer evenings when the manor felt too small and too full of other people's ambitions. And she let herself feel what she had held in check for the last 3 hours. The grief was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with sobs or fury. It moved through her quietly, the way cold water moves through a crack in stone, finding every hollow, filling every gap, leaving nothing untouched. She pressed her palm flat against the bark of the oak tree and breathed. And she thought, with the particular honesty that comes when you are alone and there is no one left to perform strength for. I deserved better than that. Whatever I am, wherever I came from, I deserved better than that. It was the first time in her life she had thought those words without immediately following them with a correction. It would not be the last. 3 nights later, something happened that had not happened in Wolfgar in living memory. The moon rose and did not set. Not the way it usually lingered near the horizon in certain seasons, but fully, brilliantly, anchored at the midpoint of the sky hours past the point when it should have moved on. The light it cast was not the ordinary silver white of a clear night. It was warmer than that, and deeper, and it threw shadows with unusual sharpness, as though the moon itself was paying close attention to the world below. In the village, old McGee woke her husband Harvey at 2 in the morning and pointed at the window. "That is not natural," she told him. "Everything is natural," Harvey said, pulling the blanket over his head. "Some things are just more natural than others." "Harvey, the moon has not moved in 4 hours." Harvey sat up, looked at the window, looked back at his wife. "I am going to the temple," he said. By dawn, half the village was gathered at the moon temple on the hill above Wolfgar's eastern quarter. The elder priest, a lean and careful man named Donald, stood outside the temple doors and looked at the sky and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said only this: "She is watching." He did not explain who he meant. He did not need to. Every wolf in Wolfgar knew the name of the one who had woven the sacred mate bond into the fabric of their world. Every pack child had been taught her name before their first shift. Bridget Hessler, the moon goddess. The first and oldest and the one who was present at the beginning of the wolf bloodlines, before kingdoms, before pack law, before any alpha had sat on any throne and convinced himself that his authority superseded the order of the divine. She was watching, and somewhere in the manor house, Diana Eslick was sleeping, unaware that the night sky had paused on her behalf. She discovered the first sign 4 days after the ceremony, during a routine visit to the village on the eastern road. A young boy named, according to his mother, absolutely impossible to keep still, had stepped on a rusted nail behind the mill and developed a fever that had not broken in 2 days. Diana had come with her herbs and her careful hands, and she had sat with the boy through the afternoon, cleaning the wound and applying a poultice she had mixed from memory. When she laid her hands over the wound to check the swelling, the boy's fever broke. Not gradually. Not over the course of an hour the way fevers were supposed to break. In the space of a single breath. The boy looked up at her with clear eyes and said, with the directness of small children everywhere, "You are warm like a candle." Diana looked at her own hands. They were glowing, just faintly, just enough that in the low light of the cottage interior, they were unmistakably luminous. She closed her fingers. The light faded. She looked up to find the boy's mother staring at her with an expression suspended somewhere between awe and terror. Diana said and stopped. She had no explanation. She had no language for what had just happened. She left the cottage quietly and walked home slowly, turning her hands over and over in the afternoon light, looking for evidence that she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. The news spread through the village the way all extraordinary news spreads in small places. Quickly, with elaboration, and in every direction at once. By that evening, McGee had told Harvey. Harvey had told his brother Donald at the temple, and Donald had opened his oldest text and begun reading with the focused urgency of a man who has found the passage he has been dreading for years. The Moon Temple sat on the hill above Wolfgar's eastern quarter like a patient witness to everything that happened in the valley below. It was older than the citadel. Older than most of the pack's formal records. Its walls were carved from pale stone quarried from the mountain ridge, and at its center stood a circular chamber open to the sky, where the moon's light fell directly during significant celestial events. Diana had not been to the temple in years. Not because she lacked faith, but because formal temple attendance at Wolfgar was a privilege of rank, and Diana had learned not to claim privileges that would be questioned. She went now because something was pulling her there, a direction, a warmth that intensified as she climbed the hill and faded when she turned away from it. Like a tide, like a compass. She arrived at the temple on the 5th night after the ceremony, when the moon was directly above the open chamber and the light fell through the circular opening with unusual clarity. Donald the elder priest was there, sitting on the stone bench near the entrance, wrapped in his gray ceremonial cloak. He looked unsurprised to see her. "I was wondering when you would come," he said. "I did not plan to," Diana told him honestly. "The best arrivals rarely are planned." He gestured for her to enter the chamber. "Go inside. Stand in the light. Whatever happens, do not be afraid." She stepped into the circular chamber. The moonlight hit her the moment she crossed the threshold, and the world changed. Not dramatically. There was no thunderclap, no great divine performance of power. The light simply became warmer, and the warmth moved through her from crown to soul like a slow tide finding its level, and in the warmth there was a voice. Not loud, not commanding, but impossibly clear, the way a still pool of water is clear, right down to the stone at its bottom. The voice said, "You are not what they told you you were." Diana stood very still. The voice said, "Your mother's bloodline does not begin with a healer woman from the southern villages. It begins with the first moon priestess of Wolfgar, who chose love over power and gave her gift to her children rather than to a throne. That gift has been sleeping in your blood for 3 generations. It woke 4 days ago, when your heart broke open and did not close against the world." Diana felt tears on her face without fully understanding when they had started. The voice said, "I do not need your thanks. I need your courage. The road ahead of you is not easy, but you will not walk it alone. Not anymore. The warmth faded slowly, the way the last light of day fades. Not in an instant, but in gradual retreat that still leaves a glow on the horizon long after the sun is gone. Diana stood in the chamber for a long time after. Then she sat down on the stone floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and thought, with a growing steadiness, all right, if that is what I am, then I had better learn to be it properly. The news reached the citadel within a week, the way all significant news eventually does, through servants who heard it from merchants who had spoken to villagers who had been present at the mill when the boy's fever broke. By the time the story arrived in the great hall, it had accumulated the usual additions and embellishments, but its core truth remained intact. Diana Eslick had healed a child with her bare hands, and the Moon Temple elder had reportedly gone pale when he heard the details. Tanya heard the story during a private breakfast and spent the rest of the morning very still in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Her attendant, a careful young woman named Kelsey who had been assigned from the household staff, watched her mistress's stillness with the particular alertness of someone who has learned that Tanya's quiet is more dangerous than her anger. When Tanya finally spoke, it was to request a private meeting with her father. Alfredo arrived within the hour, which was itself a statement. He was not a man who moved quickly for anyone. The village stories about Diana need to stop, Tanya said without preamble. Whatever she is doing out there, it is drawing attention. Stories about a girl healing a feverish child are not a political threat, Alfredo said. The kind of stories that start with a feverish child and end with a following are always a political threat, Tanya replied. You taught me that. Alfredo was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the bread on the table and tore off a piece with the measured calm of a man thinking several moves ahead. Keep your own counsel on this, he said finally. And be patient. Diana has no status, no allies, no resources. She is not a threat. She is a curiosity. She is connected to the mate bond, Tanya said. That makes her exactly the kind of curiosity that destroys arrangements. Alfredo looked at his daughter for a long moment. And behind his eyes, very deep where Tanya could not see, something that had been carefully buried for many years shifted in its resting place. He knew what Diana was. He had known for years. He had chosen to bury it because it complicated everything he had built. Be patient, he said again and left. Tanya watched him go, and she decided, as she had decided many things in her life, that she would handle this herself. Diana did not set out to build a following. She set out, as she always had, to help the people who needed help. But the gift that had woken in her was growing. Where she walked through a field, the crops responded. Not in the wild, overabundant way of the old harvest stories. Not wheat growing to the rooftops or fruit trees bursting overnight. It was subtler than that and more real. The crops that had been struggling with the dry summer turned their faces toward the sun a little more strongly. The soil in the plots where she had knelt to examine roots held moisture a little longer. The village wells on the eastern road, which had been dropping for 2 dry seasons, steadied. McGee told Harvey. Harvey told his brother at the temple. Donald recorded it and then went back to his old texts with renewed urgency. The village women began leaving things at Diana's usual path, not offerings exactly, but the kind of gifts that people give when they do not have the words for what they feel. Preserved fruit in sealed jars. Hand-sewn cloth. Once, memorably, a very old and slightly aggressive rooster that old McGee insisted was the finest bird in 3 counties, and which Diana rehomed to a farm where he immediately became the problem of someone else's mourning. She moved among the people the way water moves, without demanding a particular shape, filling whatever space needed filling. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names and children's names and the particular difficulty of each family's season. When a dispute broke out between 2 farming families over water rights, she sat with both of them for an entire afternoon and found a solution so practical that both families left satisfied and slightly embarrassed that they had needed help to see it. It was William who noticed first from the citadel. William was Cody's beta. Loyal to a degree that occasionally troubled him, because loyalty to a man who is making a mistake is a complicated thing to manage. He was in his late 30s, broad across the shoulders, with a steady face and eyes that had seen enough to make him skeptical of easy answers. He had served Cody since they were both young men, and he had never, in all those years, had cause to question whether he was serving the right person. He was beginning quietly to question it now. He had started riding through the villages on his afternoon rounds earlier than usual, and taking longer routes, and asking the village heads questions he had not asked before. What he learned over the course of 3 weeks rearranged something in his understanding of the situation. He brought it to Cody carefully, the way you carry something fragile across an uneven floor. "The eastern villages are experiencing something unusual," William said, during the morning briefing that Cody kept tight and efficient. "The crops are recovering. The water levels are stabilizing. The healers are reporting that their patients are responding better than expected to treatment." "Good weather," Cody said, without looking up from the map he was annotating. "The reports attribute it to Diana Eslick." The room went quiet. Cody set down his pen. "The people believe she is the reason for the recovery? Some believe it. Others have simply observed it. Charles Smith has begun documenting the incidents formally, dates, locations, witness accounts. He presented a preliminary record to the Temple Council yesterday." Cody looked at the map for a long moment. "It changes nothing," he said. William said nothing. He had learned, over the years, that silence was sometimes more honest than argument. Charles Smith was Wolfgar's royal historian. A lean, careful man of 50 with ink-stained fingers and the particular patience of someone whose profession requires reading between lines that other people have tried very hard to make invisible. He worked in the archive tower at the northwestern corner of the Citadel, surrounded by texts that predated the current Alpha bloodline by several centuries, and he had spent 30 years developing a professional suspicion of any record that seemed too clean. The record of Diana Eslick's birth had been bothering him for years. It was too simple. Most records of that era were complex with annotation. Names crossed out and re-entered, dates disputed, lineage claims argued across multiple documents. Diana's record was a single line on a single page, written in a hand that Charles did not recognize, noting only that a female child had been born to Lord Alfredo Eslick by an unnamed woman of the southern settlements. No date of the mother's death. No record of how the child came to be placed in the Eslick household. No reference to the child's maternal line at all. People who truly have nothing worth hiding do not arrange their records this carefully. Charles began cross-referencing. It took him 11 days, 3 late nights, and one very uncomfortable conversation with an elderly archivist who had served during Alfredo's father's time and who, once Charles made clear that he was asking as a matter of formal historical record, told him something that turned Charles's understanding of the entire situation inside out. Diana's mother had not been a simple healer woman from the south. She had been the last descendant of the Wolfgar moon priestess line, a bloodline that predated the Alpha Rodriguez family by several generations and which carried, according to the old pack laws, a formal claim to the role of High Luna that superseded any political appointment. Alfredo had known. He had hidden it. He had buried the records and planted a simplified false account, and he had done it with sufficient thoroughness that it had taken 30 years and a very suspicious historian to find the original documentation buried 4 layers deep in the archive's secondary collection. Charles sat back in his chair and looked at the document in his hands. Then he looked at the locked drawer in his desk where he kept his most sensitive materials. Then he reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. The financial irregularities had been present in the Eslick accounts for years. The kind of irregularities that look like administrative errors if you only examine one season's records. The kind that reveal a systematic pattern when you examine 10 years of records side by side. William found them 3 weeks after Charles began his archive research, during a routine review of the grain supply agreements between Wolfgar and the Fernwood Valley estates. A consistent discrepancy between the quantity of grain reported delivered and the quantity that arrived in Wolfgar stores. Always slightly less, never enough to trigger an immediate investigation, always accounted for with explanations so reasonable they were almost convincing. Almost. William was a beta. He had spent 15 years managing the operational details of a large pack. He had reviewed enough supply records to know what honest administrative variance looked like, and what he was looking at now did not look like that. He brought the figures to Cody that evening, after the formal council session had ended and the great hall had emptied. Cody looked at the numbers for a long time. "Bring me the original contracts." "I already have them." William laid them on the table. The shortage amounts to approximately 43,000 measures of grain over 6 years. At market value, that represents the equivalent of 2 full years of Wolfgar winter food reserves. Cody stared at the documents. He said very quietly, "Where did it go?" William had spent the better part of 2 days on that question. He had followed the partial ledger trails as far as they went, and where they ended, he had spoken to merchants and transport drivers and warehouse managers who were, once William applied a certain calm and deliberate pressure, willing to describe what they had seen. To Lord Alfredo's private holdings, and to a secondary account that appears to be connected to a man named Captain Jerome. Cody went very still. Jerome was not a name that belonged in the same sentence as Wolfgar's food supply. Jerome was a mercenary captain who operated across the northern border territories, a man known for taking difficult contracts and delivering results through methods that did not hold up well to scrutiny. He had never had formal business with Wolfgar. He had no reason to be connected to Alfredo Eslick's financial records, unless there was a plan in motion that Cody had not been aware of. The cold understanding of how badly he had been positioned in his own kingdom moved through Cody Rodriguez like the first ice of winter moving through a river, not all at once, but inexorable. "Tell no one else," he said to William. "Yet." William nodded. Then, because they had known each other for 15 years and William had earned the right, he said, "And Diana?" Cody looked at his beta. For a moment, something passed across his face that was too complicated to name simply. "What about her?" "Charles Smith has been asking questions about her maternal lineage. I believe he has found something significant." Cody was quiet for a long moment. "Arrange a meeting with him tomorrow." Charles Smith presented his findings in Cody's private study, with William present and the door latched. He laid the documents out in chronological order on the wide oak desk and walked through them the way a navigator walks a captain through unfamiliar waters. Steadily, carefully, marking the dangerous points with particular precision. He explained what the Moon Priestess bloodline was, what it meant under the old pack laws, what it meant for Diana's formal claim to status within Wolfgar, and what it meant, given everything, that Lord Alfredo Eslick had spent years deliberately burying this information. Cody listened without interrupting. His expression, when Charles finished, was not readable. "You are telling me," Cody said slowly, "that the woman I rejected publicly in front of the entire kingdom is not only my fated mate but the rightful High Luna of Wolfgar by bloodline, and that her father has known this since before she was born." "That is what the documents indicate, my Alpha." Cody stood up. He walked to the window that looked out over the Citadel's inner courtyard. He was quiet for long enough that William began to wonder whether he should say something. Then Cody said, with the particular flat certainty of a man who has just understood the full scope of his mistakes, "I built my kingdom's future on an alliance with a man who stole from us, manipulated us, and hid the one person with both a divine bond and a formal bloodline claim to this throne. And I thanked him for it." Neither Charles nor William responded to that. There was nothing useful to add. "The grain records," Cody continued, "the Jerome connection, the Eslick accounts. I need all of it formalized and presented to the council. And I need it done before Alfredo has any indication that we have found it." "That gives us perhaps a week," William said. "His household staff reports to him regularly. If anyone in the Citadel has noticed Charles' research, word may already be moving. Then we move faster." It was, everyone would agree later, the first decision Cody Rodriguez made in many months that was genuinely sound. Tanya found out about the investigation on the 3rd day. Her source was not a spy, exactly. More a well-positioned household attendant who was paid generously and asked only to pass along anything that seemed significant. What seemed significant on the 3rd day was the sight of Charles Smith carrying a sealed document case through the Citadel's east corridor in the direction of the council chambers at an hour when he normally went home for dinner. By that evening, Tanya was in her private sitting room writing a letter to Captain Jerome. By the following morning, Jerome's response had arrived, hand-delivered by a courier whose uniform bore no identifying marks, and Tanya had read it twice and burned it in her fireplace. Her attendant Kelsey, who had been asked to bring fresh candles and arrived just in time to see the last edge of paper curl to ash, stored this detail away in her memory with the careful precision that people who have learned to survive difficult households develop as a matter of necessity. She waited for the right moment to mention it. The midpoint of the story, the moment that even the most skeptical historians would later agree was a genuine turning point, came on a morning in late autumn when Diana was walking through the village market with a basket of herbs, and the sun was doing its level best to make the day pleasant despite a wind that had other opinions. She had been aware of the changes in herself for weeks now. The warmth in her hands when she healed. The way crops seemed to respond to her presence. The increasingly vivid dreams in which a silver-eyed woman stood at the edge of a vast landscape and watched her with an expression that Diana had learned, over multiple dreams, to interpret as not disapproval but something closer to hopeful expectation. She had been managing all of this quietly, the way she managed most things in her life, by not making it anyone else's problem, by continuing to show up and do the work, by trusting that whatever was happening would eventually clarify itself. What she had not managed was an audience of several thousand. The market was crowded that morning. The autumn harvest festival preparations were underway, and traders from 5 surrounding settlements had set up stalls along the main thoroughfare. Diana had been stopped twice for herb consultations and once to help a child who had twisted her ankle on the cobblestones, and she was navigating her way toward the eastern stall when the sky changed. Not dramatically. Not with thunder or lightning or any of the traditional announcements of divine attention. The sky simply became very clear, impossibly specifically clear, the kind of clarity that happens in certain mountain dawns when the air holds still, and the light sharpened in a way that made everything in the market look as though it had been carefully lit by someone with a particular artistic intention. And in that light, from the direction of the Moon Temple Hill, a figure descended. She was tall and moved with the particular ease of someone who has never needed to hurry because time itself adjusts its pace for her. She wore robes the color of deep moonlight, not white exactly, but the luminous gray that exists at the edge between night and dawn. Her hair was silver white and unbound. Her eyes, when she turned them on the market crowd, were the color of a full moon's reflection in still water. Everything about her was calm. Nothing about her was small. The market went completely silent. Every wolf in that square felt the same thing in the same moment. The particular resonant awe that the body produces when it encounters something older and more powerful than everything it has previously understood. Bridget Hessler, the moon goddess, present in mortal form for the first time in longer than anyone alive could remember. She walked through the parted crowd without looking left or right, without acknowledging the silence except to move through it with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going. She stopped in front of Diana. Diana, for her part, did not run or faint or perform any of the reactions that might have been forgiven given the circumstances. She stood her ground, with her herb basket on her arm and her dark hair slightly windswept, and she looked at the goddess with eyes that had learned, over a very difficult year, to meet what the world presented with steady attention. Bridget Hessler looked at her for a long moment. Then she raised her voice, not loudly but clearly, in the way that does not need volume because what it carries is weightier than sound. People of Wolfgar, I come before you to name what you have already witnessed with your own eyes. This woman, Diana Eslick, daughter of the Moon Priestess line, carries my blessing and my authority. She is the rightful High Luna of Wolfgar by bloodline, by bond, and by character. Any hand raised against her is raised against the order that has governed this world since before your first Alpha drew breath. I have spoken. She turned to Diana then, and in a voice meant only for the two of them, said, You are exactly what you needed to be. Now be it boldly. And then she was gone. Not gradually. Not in a dramatic fade. Simply gone, the way a candle goes out. Present and then not, with only the warmth in the air left to prove it had been real. The market remained silent for another 10 full seconds. Then old McGee, who had been buying turnips from a stall 3 rows back and had elbowed her way to the front just in time, turned to the man beside her and said with magnificent finality, "I told Harvey she was not a curiosity." The formal presentation of Charles Smith's findings to the Pack Council happened on a cold Tuesday morning with the first real snow of the season dusting the Citadel's outer walls. Cody stood at the head of the council table, not yet the broken alpha of the later chapters, but already something had shifted in him, something that the events of the preceding weeks had been quietly rearranging. The council listened to Charles's documentation in the precise, careful silence that powerful people deploy when they are rapidly recalculating. When Charles finished, the eldest council member, a woman in her 70s named simply the Elder, as all council members at her rank are addressed, folded her hands on the table and said, "And Lord Alfredo Eslick has been made aware that this investigation exists?" "He has not," Cody said. "He will need to be brought before the council to answer for these records." "Agreed. William, have Lord Alfredo escorted to the Citadel this morning." The message was sent. The morning passed. Alfredo Eslick did not arrive. What arrived instead, at midday, was a report from the northern gate that a company of approximately 200 armed men, bearing no pack colors, no formal insignia, had been spotted moving through the Fernwood Valley toward Wolfgar's outer settlements. Jerome had moved. The timeline Tanya had set in motion when she burned the letter was considerably shorter than anyone had anticipated. The villages on Wolfgar's outer edge were not military positions. They were farming communities with no walls and no garrison. When Jerome's company hit the first 3 settlements, they moved through them quickly and efficiently, taking stores of food and whatever valuables were accessible, and leaving the residents shaken and this would become significant later, not physically harmed. Jerome was precise in his intimidation. He wanted compliance, not corpses. Corpses complicated things. What he had not accounted for was Diana. She was in the second village when the company arrived, the one that had become, in the past weeks, something of an informal gathering point for the people who had been quietly watching her and wondering what exactly was happening. There were perhaps 40 villagers present, including McGee, Harvey, a group of the village healers, and a cluster of young wolves who had heard the goddess's words in the market and taken them as seriously as the older residents had. When Jerome's soldiers came through the eastern gate, they found the village square occupied. Diana Eslick stood at the center of it. She was not armed. She was not performing bravery. She was simply standing there, in her plain clothes with her dark hair braided back, and she looked at the armed men with the particular calm of someone who has decided, in the quiet of their own conscience, what they are willing to stand for. "You will not take from these people," she said. Her voice did not shake. "This village has earned everything it has through seasons of labor and hardship. If Jerome wants to negotiate terms with Wolfgar, there is a council for that purpose. Send a representative to the Citadel. What you are doing here is not negotiation. It is theft, and it will stop." The lead soldier looked at her. He was a competent and experienced man who had taken many villages before this one, and what he was looking at did not match his usual experience of village squares. There was something in the quality of the silence around this woman that made him pause. Something in the way the 40 people behind her were not afraid. He pulled his company back. Not permanently, not because Diana had resolved the situation, but the pause she created was long enough for Wolfgar's 1st Cavalry Unit, which William had dispatched when the initial reports came in, to arrive. It was enough. The formal uprising, Jerome's full attempt to seize control of Wolfgar's outer territories, began 4 days later, coordinated with an attempt by Lord Alfredo to declare the existing council null and void on the basis of what he called procedural irregularities. A legal argument so thin it barely survived the first hour of examination. Alfredo was brought before the council by force on the 2nd day, escorted by 6 of Wolfgar's senior guards. He arrived with his rings on and his composure in place, and he spoke for 20 minutes about procedural law and historical precedent. And he was midway through an explanation of why the grain records Charles had found were simply misattributed administrative documents when the elder held up one hand and said, "Lord Eslick, we have the original documents. We have the testimony of 6 merchants who witnessed the transfer of those goods." We have the account records your own household clerk provided when asked directly whether these numbers were accurate. Please stop speaking. Alfredo stopped speaking. In the silence that followed, something very old and very carefully maintained. His certainty that he was positioned beyond consequence dissolved. Jerome's campaign lasted 11 days. He was a competent military tactician, and his company at its largest numbered nearly 400 men. Wolfgar's forces were numerically comparable, but what Jerome had not fully calculated was the effect of the preceding weeks on the people of the outer villages. They were not passive. Diana had not organized them into a fighting force. She had done something more durable and more difficult. She had spent weeks among them, listening to them, helping them, treating them as people whose concerns mattered and whose well-being was worth protecting. And when the threat came for their homes and their stores and their children, they did not wait to be told what to do. They organized themselves. Harvey and a group of the village men built a message relay system that fed intelligence on Jerome's company movements to Wolfgar's cavalry in near real time. McGee and the village women organized the movement of the elderly and the children to safer positions before each expected engagement. The village healers, working alongside Diana, set up care stations that could be mobilized quickly. William, coordinating from the Citadel with information he had never had access to in previous campaigns because previous campaigns had not included the outer villages as active participants, was audibly impressed. He told Cody on the 7th day of the campaign, with the directness of a man who has run out of patience for the slower processes of realization. She built something you were never able to build in 15 years of governance. She built a pack that trusts itself. Cody was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Tanya's final gambit came on the 9th day, when it became clear that Jerome's campaign was failing. She had spent the preceding week conducting herself with flawless composure in the Citadel, attending the formal council sessions as Cody's announced bride, maintaining every appearance of a woman unconcerned by the events outside the Citadel walls. She had smiled. She had made gracious remarks about the difficulty of the situation. She had been, by any external measure, exemplary. And she had, in that same period, arranged the abduction of 12 wolf pups, children of 3 families in the outer villages, taken during a night when Jerome's company had swept through a section of territory that the relay system had briefly lost contact with. The message arrived at the Citadel the following morning, written in Tanya's own careful hand. The pups would be brought to the Moon Temple and held there. If Wolfgar's forces did not stand down, if Jerome was not permitted safe passage out of the territory, and if Cody did not formally dissolve the council investigation into House Eslick, the consequences would be severe. The Citadel became very still when the message was read aloud. The kind of still that happens when people who have been holding onto a manageable understanding of a situation are suddenly required to revise it significantly upward. She has 12 children, William said, in a voice stripped of all professional inflection. I heard the message. What are we doing? Cody looked at the message for a moment longer. Then he folded it. We are going to the Moon Temple, he said. I am going first. Alone. That is my decision, William. The Moon Temple had never looked less peaceful. Tanya had positioned 12 wolf pups in the open circular chamber at the temple's center, seated in a loose cluster on the stone floor, with Jerome's soldiers positioned at the 4 entrances. She herself stood at the temple's highest point, on the broad stone step below the altar, in a white gown that she had, with remarkable composure under the circumstances, changed into before leaving the Citadel. If she was going to make a statement, she intended to make it correctly dressed. Cody arrived at the temple gate without armor, without guards. He had left both at the base of the hill, over William's furious objection, on the grounds that arriving armed and accompanied would solve nothing. He walked through the temple in trance with his hands visible and his pace unhurried. Tanya watched him come. Her expression was composed in the way that something is composed when it is very close to not being composed anymore. You came alone, she said. Yes. That is either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, he said. Tanya, let them go. Whatever you believe you can accomplish here, it is over. Jerome's campaign has failed. Your father is before the council. This, he gestured at the chamber, the soldiers, the children, will not save any of that. It will only add to the accounting. Tanya's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly at the edges. I spent years building toward this, she said, and her voice, for the first time, was not careful. It was tired and brittle and entirely real. Every arrangement, every alliance, every morning spent making myself exactly what an alpha's bride should be, and it counted for nothing because of some ancient bond that no one asked for and no one chose. Tell me why that is fair. Cody looked at her. He thought about several responses. He chose the honest one. It is not fair. Nothing about what happened is fair, Tanya. But harming children is not the answer to unfairness. You know that. You knew it before you did this. Something moved across Tanya's face. It was not quite guilt. She was too practiced for that to surface easily, but it was something adjacent to it. The shadow of a thing she had trained herself not to feel. She was still looking at Cody when Diana came through the temple's eastern entrance. Diana had walked the hill herself, behind Cody but faster, because she had not been told not to come and she had decided that the children were more important than anyone's plan. She arrived slightly breathless, with her dark hair coming loose from its braid, and she took in the scene in a single sweeping look. The children, the soldiers, Tanya at the altar, Cody in the center of the chamber. She crossed to the children first, which told everyone in the room something significant about her priorities. She knelt down among them, checking faces and hands, speaking quietly to the two who were crying, and she did not look at Tanya or the soldiers or even at Cody. She simply attended to the children with the same focused care she brought to every person who needed her. Tanya watched her and felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. A flicker of something that, under different circumstances in a different life, might have been shame. It did not last long. Tanya was not built for extended shame. She was built for action. She reached for the long ceremonial blade that one of Jerome's soldiers had leaned against the altar stone. Intended as a threat, a prop in the confrontation, and she moved. Not toward Diana. Toward the open space between Diana and the door, to cut off the route of escape. But in the chamber's unpredictable light, with its angles and shadows, the movement read differently than she had intended. Cody saw the blade. He saw the direction of the movement. He moved on instinct, not on strategy, not on calculation, but on something deeper and faster than either. He stepped between Tanya and Diana. The blade found his side instead of its intended angle. He went down. The sound that followed. The sound of a wounded alpha hitting the stone floor of a moon temple while 12 children and a handful of soldiers and 2 women looked on, was not particularly dramatic. It was quiet, almost. The kind of quiet that arrives when something irrevocable has just happened and the air itself pauses to acknowledge it. Tanya stood with the blade in her hand. She looked at what she had done. And she understood, with sudden and total clarity, that whatever she had intended to accomplish, this was not it. This was the end of everything. The soldiers, Jerome's men, without Jerome present to give orders, facing a situation that had moved far beyond their contract scope, dropped their weapons. All of them, in the same moment, as if the decision were obvious, which it was. Diana was already at Cody's side, her hands pressing against the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who has treated injuries too many times to waste a moment on panic. The warmth in her hands was stronger than it had ever been. She pressed it into the wound and felt it working and felt the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether it would be enough. And she did what she had learned in the hardest year of her life. She stayed present, she kept her hands steady, and she refused to let fear make her decisions for her. The Moon Temple's circular chamber had been many things over the centuries it had stood. It had been a place of ceremony and grief and celebration and silence. It had been a place where significant things were decided. It had never, in living memory, been a place where the moon goddess appeared in mortal form for the second time in a single season. The light came first. The same warm, specific clarity as the market. Then the presence, and then Bridget Hessler herself, standing at the edge of the circular chamber with her moonlit robes and her silver eyes and her expression of a woman who has been watching something unfold for a very long time and has decided that the moment for direct intervention has arrived. She looked at Cody first. He was conscious, barely, supported by Diana's hands. The wound was not healing as quickly as it should have. The blade had been cold iron, which resists the wolf's natural recovery. But Diana's warmth was working, slowly, at the edges of the damage. Bridget spoke to Cody. Her voice was not unkind, but it was without any of the softness that kindness uses to cushion truth. You chose ambition over sacred bond. You chose fear over courage. You chose the approval of the powerful over the protection of the vulnerable. You made your fated mate kneel in the dust before an audience of thousands, and you called it politics. She paused. And then you stepped between a blade and an innocent woman, without calculation, without strategy, because it was the right thing to do, and that is the first time in a very long while that you have done something purely because it was right. Cody said nothing. There was nothing to say. The question before us now, Bridget said, is not whether you deserve to live. That has always been in Diana's hands. She turned to Diana. You know what I am asking. Diana looked down at the man whose humiliation of her had been witnessed by thousands, whose choices had set an entire season of suffering in motion, whose wound was under her hands because he had made, in the final moment, one genuinely selfless decision. She thought about the oak tree at the bend in the road. She thought about the night she had sat against its roots and let herself feel what the world had done to her. She thought about the thought she had had then. I deserved better than that. She still believed that. She would always believe that. But she also knew, with the particular clarity that comes from having been broken open and rebuilt from the inside out, that bitterness was a crown that would outlast any throne. That mercy was not the same thing as forgetting. That what she chose to do with her power in this moment would define what kind of leader she was going to be for the rest of her life. She pressed her hands more firmly against the wound. The warmth poured out of her in a wave. Be well, she said. Simply, quietly, the way she said everything. The wound closed. Bridget Hessler watched this and was satisfied. She turned to Tanya last, and the quality of her regard changed. Not to anger, but to the precise, clear assessment of something that has been weighed and found wanting. You were given gifts that many are denied. Intelligence, beauty, position, resources. You chose to use all of them for accumulation rather than for good. You treated people as pieces in a game that was only ever about you. You involved children in a confrontation between adults to serve your own ambition. A pause that carried the weight of centuries. The consequences of your choices will last longer than this throne. The rebuilding of what you have helped damage will take years. And you will live with what you chose clearly, without the comfort of believing you were forced into it. That is judgment enough. Then the goddess was gone, and the morning light fell through the open chamber ceiling, and the 12 wolf pups, who had been sitting through all of this with the admirable stoicism that small children develop when adults around them do confusing things, collectively decided that they were hungry, and several of them said so at once, and the chamber filled with the entirely ordinary sound of children demanding breakfast. Which was, by any measure, the correct way for the divine portion of the morning to end. The accounting that followed was not swift. Justice in Wolfgar had never been swift, which was part of what made it worth anything. Lord Alfredo Eslick appeared before the council in a formal proceeding that lasted 3 days. Charles Smith presented his documentation. The merchants gave their testimony. The household clerk who had provided the financial records spoke clearly and without hesitation about what he had witnessed over 6 years of employment. Alfredo's defense, presented by the most expensive legal counsel he could obtain on short notice, argued procedural complications and historical misattribution and the complexity of long-term estate management. The council listened to all of it. Then the elder folded her hands and said they were not persuaded. Alfredo Eslick was removed from all formal positions, his estates placed under council administration pending a full audit, and his personal freedom restricted to the citadel for a period of 10 years pending the completion of the legal proceedings. The Fernwood Valley, the land that had started everything, the strategic alliance that Cody had believed was worth any cost, was transferred to Wolfgar's direct administration, which meant that the winter grain problem Cody had been trying to solve was solved. just not in the way he had intended. It solved itself because the thing he had refused was the very thing he needed. Tanya was held under formal arrest pending investigation into the abduction of the wolf pups and her role in coordinating Jerome's campaign. The formal proceedings took 4 months. At their conclusion, she was sentenced to 5 years removal from all public life, her formal betrothal to Cody dissolved, and her political influence within the Northern Territories permanently curtailed. She did not speak at her sentencing. She was, to the end, composed, and in the years that followed, removed from the stage she had spent her whole life performing on. She had a great deal of time to sit with questions she had never previously allowed herself to ask. Some of them she eventually answered honestly. That was, perhaps, the beginning of something better than the life she had lived. Captain Jerome was captured on the 12th day of the campaign, at the northern border, attempting to reach territory beyond Wolfgar's jurisdiction. He had, in fact, never intended to serve Tanya's interests. She had been a useful tool for his own plan to position himself as the controlling power behind whatever new arrangement emerged from the chaos. He had simply miscalculated the speed and coherence of Wolfgar's response. He was brought before the council and sentenced to 20 years, the exact length of time he had spent building a career on other people's disasters. Cody Rodriguez's formal accounting was not an external proceeding. It was personal. He resigned his Alpha title 3 weeks after the events at the Moon Temple, in a formal council session that he requested himself and that surprised everyone except William, who had been watching his Alpha's face for long enough to know what resignation looks like when it's brewing. He stood before the council and said, with a directness that was perhaps the most genuinely honest he had ever been in a formal setting, "I made choices that damaged this kingdom and harmed people who deserved protection. I cannot lead a pack I am not yet worthy of. I am stepping down and placing myself in a period of service, not governance, until the council and the people of Wolfgar are satisfied that I have earned a different standing." The council received this without comment. The elder nodded once, which in her economy of expression meant she approved. William was appointed acting beta in the interim, which he found simultaneously appropriate and exhausting. Cody spent the following year working in the outer villages. Not overseeing, not managing, physically working. He helped rebuild the stores that Jerome's company had disrupted. He hauled timber. He repaired fences. He sat with Harvey one evening and listened to the man explain, with the patient thoroughness of someone who has spent years watching things from the ground, what life in the outer villages actually looked like and what the people there actually needed from their leadership. It was, by Cody's own account, the most educational year of his life, and he was not entirely alone in it. Diana did not forgive Cody quickly. She did not see why she should. Forgiveness was not the same thing as absolution, and she had spent enough time among the people of Wolfgar to understand that those who were hurt too easily by a charming apology were often hurt again. What she watched, instead, was behavior over time. What a person did when there was no audience. What choices they made when the situation was simple rather than strategic. She watched him rebuild fences with Harvey and ask questions afterward instead of giving answers. She watched him sit with the young Mother Kelsey's family through an evening of difficulty without being asked and without making it about himself. She watched him, on a cold morning in late winter, find old McGee struggling with a loaded cart on an icy road and walk with her the full mile to the mill without once seeming to think this was beneath him. She registered all of it. She did not register it easily or without considerable internal argument. She had been humiliated publicly by this man in front of thousands of people. That was not a thing that washed away with winter thaw. The bond between them had always been present. She had felt it every day since the engagement ceremony, a persistent, inconvenient warmth that she had spent months being irritated at the universe for installing in her without her consent. But the bond was not what decided her. What decided her was a morning in early spring, when she was coming down the hill from the temple and she found Cody sitting on the steps of the village hall with a small notebook, writing something. He didn't see her immediately, and she had a moment to observe him without the performance of interaction. He was bent over the page with the particular attention of someone trying to get something right, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, not the rigid command posture she had seen at the engagement ceremony, but something more human and less armored that made her stop. He looked up, Their eyes met, and the bond, which had been patient and steady through an entire year of complication, settled in the air between them like a held note finally released. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A formal letter of apology," he said. "To you. I have written 17 drafts. This is the 18th. Diana looked at him for a moment. "How are they going?" "Badly. I keep finding things that are true that I also wish were not true." "That is how apologies are supposed to feel," she said. She sat down on the step beside him. "Not close, not yet, but present. You can read it to me when you are ready," she said. "But I should tell you, what I want from you is not a letter. Letters can be edited. What I want is the next several years of consistent choices. After that, we can talk about what the bond means and what we want to do with it." Cody was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a simplicity that was possibly the most alpha thing about him, "That is fair. It was the beginning of something true. It was not quick. It was not easy. But it was real." Diana Eslick became High Luna of Wolfgar in a ceremony that looked nothing like the engagement ceremony that had started everything. There was no performance. There was no crowd arranged to witness a political transaction. There was the Moon Temple and the Pack Council and Donald the Elder Priest and William and McGee and Harvey who had driven their cart up the hill and argued about the best parking position for 20 minutes. There was Charles Smith in the second row with his notebook, recording everything with the careful precision of a historian who understands he is witnessing something that will matter to the people who come after. There was Cody, standing not above Diana but beside her, in formal but plain clothes, having specifically declined the ceremonial armor because Diana had mentioned once that she found elaborate armor slightly ridiculous on indoor occasions, and he had filed this away without comment and acted on it. And there was Diana in silver and white. Not the elaborate construction of Tanya's engagement gown, but something simpler and more beautiful, because Diana had never needed the architecture of appearance to be the most significant person in any room. Bridget Hessler did not appear. She did not need to. Her blessing was already present in every crop that grew steadily in the outer fields, every well that held its water through the dry season, every village that had learned over the preceding year that the leadership of Wolfgar was aware of their existence and considered them worth protecting. When Diana received the formal title and the council's oath of loyalty, she said something that Charles Smith underlined 3 times in his notebook and later included in the opening of the official history of the Rodriguez-Eslick era. "I do not take this role as a reward. I take it as a responsibility. The people of Wolfgar, all of them, in the citadel and in the farthest village and every settlement in between, are what this title exists to serve, not the other way around. That is the only governance I know how to offer, and I will offer it for as long as you will have me." McGee in the second row nodded vigorously. Harvey, beside her, wept openly and then denied it when anyone asked. The golden age of Wolfgar was not golden in the way of legends, perfect, shining, without difficulty. It was golden in the more durable way of genuinely good things. Steady, honest, built on structures that held because they were grounded in reality rather than ambition. Diana built a network of village healers trained to the same standard as the citadel physicians. She established a formal record system for the outer settlements, so that their crops, their water, their disputes, and their needs were documented and addressed rather than ignored until they became crises. She created 3 scholarships per year, funded from the Fernwood Valley's restored income, for young wolves from outer villages to study governance, medicine, or history. Because she had grown up as someone whose knowledge was self-taught and provisional, and she knew what it cost people to have potential without access. William continued as beta through the new administration and discovered, after 2 decades of serving an alpha who believed in control, that working within a leadership structure that valued competence and honesty was a somewhat disorienting pleasure. Charles Smith published his full historical account of the preceding years. It was long, meticulously documented, and included 3 chapters on the economic damage caused by the Eslick grain diversion. It sold more copies in the first year than anything previously produced by the Wolfgar archive. The chapter that people read most often was the one about the market. Old McGee lived to a considerable age and spent the final decades of her life being slightly insufferable about the fact that she had known Diana was significant long before anyone else had paid attention. Harvey, to his credit, never once pointed out that he had also been there. He loved his wife too much and was too tired from the argument about cart parking to start new ones. Cody Rodriguez did not return to alpha status. He chose not to, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether he had changed. He served as Diana's senior advisor for external relations, a role that made full use of the political skills he had spent 15 years developing, without placing him in authority over the people he had spent a year learning to see clearly. It was a good use of what he was. It was a better man than he had been. What he was to Diana, what they were to each other, in the years that followed the spring morning on the village hall steps, was something that resisted the usual language of titles and roles. They were deeply, quietly, durably in love. The kind of love that does not announce itself at every opportunity because it does not need to. The kind that exists in the consistency of choosing each other, in the familiarity of knowing how the other person thinks, in the particular warmth of a bond that was always real and finally had the space to be fully inhabited. On their 3rd anniversary, marked not with a ceremony, but with a quiet evening on the hill above the Moon Temple, watching the winter stars come out, Cody told her that he was still working on the apology letter. He had reached draft 47. Diana told him that he could stop writing it now. "I have had several years of your consistent choices," she said. "That was what I asked for. That is what you gave me. And—" She looked at him in the way she had, direct, unhurried, silver-blue eyes that still changed in different light, and she said, "And you earned it." He took her hand. The stars came out over Wolfgar. The kingdom was at peace. If this story moved you, subscribe now and never miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. I want to know how far our story is traveling. And I will personally say hello to you,